You know, I don't think I'm so crazy about this bar anymore. Cool. So anyways, third-party peripherals. We've all been the little brother or best friend that's been stuck with a Mad Catz controller before, and we all remember how much they used to suck. But were there any good third-party controllers? Well, I bought a bunch of them, and let's take a look at a couple.
Starting in chronological order, the oldest joystick I currently own is the QuickShot 2, also just known as the QuickShot joystick in North America. It was originally developed for home computers such as the ZX Spectrum and Commodore Amiga. However, it works fully with the Atari 2600 and was released in 1983 in the States specifically for it. It has a turbo button on the bottom, which I guess was sort of a new thing at the time. However, most third-party controllers following this one will also have turbo buttons, you may notice. Despite being released for the Atari 2600, it has 2 buttons on it, and they both do the exact same thing. Kinda weird. One console generation later, the NES also got its own QuickShot thing, and I couldn't really find the name of this one. It's obviously trying to mimic some sort of arcade stick with the button layout, but it also has a turbo button, which arcade games didn't have, so I don't know. The final thing to note about these QuickShot joysticks is that they have suction cups on the bottom of them for some reason. I'm assuming this is so your controller sticks to your desk and doesn't really rattle around or whatever. I honestly don't know. If you like joysticks and hate suction cups, Nintendo's got your back. Technically, this isn't a third-party controller, but we'll get back to that. Anyways, here's the NES advantage. It's got a joystick, 2 turbo dials, 2 large red buttons, and a slow button, which would slow down gameplay by pausing and unpausing really, really quickly. It didn't really work that well. While we're on the topic, here's the NES Max, which was basically a smaller form factor of the same thing. Now, before you all get butthurt that I'm showing an official Nintendo product on a third-party video, these technically aren't manufactured in Japan, which is where most Nintendo products come from, so... Next up is the Sega Genesis controller by High Frequency, who according to Amazon make body cleansing materials? Anyways, this is just like a typical Sega Genesis controller, however, the D-pad feels a little bit better on it. I can do my combos in Street Fighter a lot easier on this controller compared to some others, and on top of it, it has turbo. This controller feels pretty good, especially considering the brand. You may not recognize them under the guise of High Frequency, however, they later rebranded as Mad Catz. Yeah, that Mad Catz. While we're on the topic of Mad Catz making Sega controllers, here's one for the Dreamcast. And yes, this thing is approximately the size of a boat. This D-pad makes me want to throw this controller into a river very firmly, and this controller is actually damaging its own wire by using the clip. I just lost for words. Although, to be completely honest, this is what we expect from Mad Catz. This next controller isn't third-party, I just wanted to remind you all what a PS1 controller looks like, because the next couple of these are going to be mimicking this basic style. Example number 1 of this is Gamepad by Gamepad. I couldn't find any more information on it, and the only thing written on the back is, get this, Gamepad. It's not the worst controller I've ever used, especially for early PS1. However, it certainly doesn't feel that great. The D-pad on it is alright, but the rest of the buttons are pretty mushy, and the select and start buttons are damn near unusable. Next up, High Frequency strikes back with their High Frequency PS1 Turbo controller. The buttons on this one feel pretty good, especially the chiclet buttons on the top. However, the D-pad is absolutely atrocious and is almost impossible to use for fighting games. Not too long after this controller came out, Mad Catz rebranded, so if you find a High Frequency or a Mad Catz version of this, they're the same controller, so don't get alarmed if you have one or the other. Trust me, they're the exact same thing. Next up is the Pelican Turbo, and that is the dumbest name I've ever heard in my entire life. This controller isn't too bad, but the D-pad is pretty much unusable. The buttons are pretty clicky, so it's a real shame that the D-pad just cuts into your thumb no matter what angle you're playing at. It's seriously uncomfortable. But again, the rest of the buttons work and they don't feel too bad, so I can't really give this one a fail completely. Just don't use the D-pad. But if that D-pad wasn't gross enough for you, there's always the ProPad 6 for the... I'm not sure. Honestly, I think this is a parallel port, which used to plug into computers back before USB was invented, although I'm not completely sure. That was a little bit before my time. Anyways, the ProPad 6 has amazingly clicky buttons and probably the most comfortable shoulder buttons I've ever felt of a controller from the 90s. Seriously, they feel absolutely perfect. And then you move your eyes over to the D-pad, and it's slanted. Why did they do this? It's impossible to use comfortably. This was a really poor design decision. How about just making the D-pad straight? Was this an accident? Was this a one-off? Or was this a shitty attempt at innovating? Because, spoiler alert, it didn't work. This next one isn't a third-party controller the same way as others, it's actually a knockoff, and is part of this plug-and-play Famiclone called PowerJoy, which I plan on taking a look at in a future video. However, the controller is obviously based off of a PS1 controller, so I figured I'd review it here. Despite how light and cheap this controller feels, it's actually pretty comfortable and sits in my hand around the same way a PS1 controller does. I can't imagine this would be comfortable for young children, as it would probably cut into their hands with the sharp plastic. However, if you whittled it down a little bit, I could see this being a fairly decent controller. By the way, the L and R buttons don't exist. Yeah, seriously, they just don't exist. Believe it or not, you can actually plug this controller into an Atari 2600, but it doesn't really work that well. Stepping up a generation, Mad Catz comes back, comes hard, and comes fast, and that was the worst possible way to word that. Anyways, I'm going to leave that in. Here's the Mad Catz PS2 controller, which you have almost certainly definitely used if you're of a certain age. I remember playing on this all the time at my friends' houses, because of course they took the official PS2 controllers. It works. That's really all there is to say. It's not uncomfortable, the buttons work. The joysticks are okay, although they have a little bit too much travel. It works. That's really all I can say. Next up, oh Nelly, we got a big boy, some fuel for compensation here. We got a motorcycle driver's controller. We have the Analog Controller Plus from Joytech. This is one of the weirdest controllers in my collection. For my big ass hands, it's actually pretty comfortable. However, again, for children, this would not work at all. This time, not that it was built badly, it's just far too unwieldy for a child to hold. The buttons are all shaped really bizarrely as well, although I personally don't have an issue with that. My issue lies more with the D-pad, which really isn't that bad, it's just not how I prefer to have my D-pads laid out. Next up, we got the Storm Chaser by Interact, and I'll be completely blunt here, this is one of the best controllers ever made. It is so damn comfortable, and it has so much functionality built straight into it, like a turbo button that can be mapped to any button that you have on the front of your controller, and on top of that, there's 2 additional face buttons which are actually mapped to the controller's triggers, so that way you don't actually have to move your fingers at all and can just move your thumbs if you feel more confident doing that. For fighting games, this controller is a must, and for first-person shooters, I find it to be equally as comfortable. The triggers are a little weak, but that's really the only complaint I have. And now we go from the nicest controller I've ever held to the worst. This is the GameStop PlayStation 2 controller. And it doesn't seem too bad at first. Sure, the joysticks are a little bit too close together, the face buttons are mushy as hell, but it gets worse when you look on the back. What did they do? They decided to put one of the triggers at the very, very bottom of the controller, meaning that you can't move your knuckle up and down using only one finger. You have to use a 2-finger setup, which for a lot of people just doesn't work. It's just uncomfortable to do. Personally, since I prefer moving my one index finger from the trigger to the bumper, it leads to a lot of unwarranted hand cramps. The only thing worse than this would be if GameStop stopped selling retro games with their cover art intact and advertised it on their website. Son of a bitch, I'm still salty about that. But their controller is also terrible. Eat my ass, GameStop. At least they improved slightly. Here's a GameStop Xbox 360 controller. This feels a lot more comfortable and a lot more accurate to the original Xbox 360's design. However, it's fragile as all hell. I broke off the joystick by very, very minimally moving it around.
I don't understand how they can be so fragile. It's not like I abuse my controllers or treat them like garbage. Anyways, let's take a look at our final controller for today, the Nyko Wand.
Apparently this thing is a Wii remote, although I wouldn't know, it certainly doesn't feel like one. You know what I really hate? Nice ergonomic circular buttons. I'd really like some square ones, and while we're at it, throw in a chunky D-pad. You know what, let's just make this controller physically impossible to use for all 2D side-scrollers on the Wii. And hey, let's make it impossible to use for all 3D motion games too, since the accelerometer died about a month after I bought it. The LEDs have broken, the plus and minus buttons don't really do anything. Yeah, this was a really shitty investment. You know what the sad part is? This piece of shit retailed for $30 back in the day, which was only $20 less than an actual Wii remote. The only reason why I didn't buy an actual Wii remote was because I was unemployed at the time, so this is all I could afford. This was by far one of the worst third-party controllers I've ever used.
Anyways, I hope you enjoyed my little look back at all those old retro third-party controllers. Now, if you don't mind, I'm only going to be using official hardware, which is why I'm going to be using my Chronos Max along with this keyboard and mouse to play Fortnite on the PlayStation 4.
I got banned.